Hello, everybody. We're excited to have you join us today for our webinar, Key Requirements to Network as a Service Capabilities Across Multi-Cloud Hybrid Infrastructure. Before we dive in, my name's Morgan Stern. I'm the VP of Automation Strategy at Itential, and I'm joined today by Travis Nix, who's one of our solution architects at Itential. Hey, Travis, can you take a moment to introduce yourself and tell people about your role at Itential?
Sure, Morgan. Thank you. At Itential, it's my position to help our enterprise and our service provider customers understand how to implement automation and create network as a service services within their own organizations for consumption, both internal and external.
Thank you, Travis. During today's webinar, we're going to be talking about network as a service and how to build network as a service capabilities on a platform like the Itential Automation Platform. If you have questions, please ask them along the way in the chat window, and we'll answer them during the session or as a follow-up after the session. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we dive into network as a service and NaaS related concepts, I wanted to ground the conversation with a model we use at Itential to describe the network automation and orchestration landscape. We think about it as three layers. At the top, that layer in green, those are the people and systems and applications that are requesting orchestration and automation activities from the automator. That would be things like people, where it might be network engineers who are logging into the system to run workflows, to do things like compliance activities and remediation. It's any kind of interactive activities where some person is executing the change on the network. The second would be around orders, where the network change is being requested by an order system, something like ServiceNow, for example. Third is around events. This is used in situations where people want to start doing closed loop automations, where activities in the network actually become triggers for changes that get executed by the automator. And then the fourth would be things like DevOps and SRE pipelines. Basically, any situation where you've got somebody who is creating a DevOps pipeline that wants to consume network capabilities as part of that pipeline operation. We covered a couple examples of DevOps and SRE pipelines interacting with network automation earlier this year in our CI/CD series, and we'll continue to build those out in the coming months. Down at the bottom, that purple layer represents the targets for network automation and orchestration activities. So these would be the network domains or the different technology stacks that exist within the network that are areas where we will be making the changes. So it could be creating new SD-WAN branches. It could be doing some overlay networking in a data center, doing some security policies, consuming services from the cloud. Could be any of those kinds of things. In the middle is the orchestrator and automator, and that's what's performing that automation logic. In our case, we represent most of it as workflows, as well as some of the functionality and things like the config manager toolset. Just above that, so the layer in between the orchestrator and the green would be the exposure, which is how is that system exposing its capabilities for consumption? So that can be things like an API, that can be things like a UI. But in our case, it's both. And one of the things that we wanted to reinforce as part of this message was just having an API northbound doesn't necessarily translate to network as a service, right? An API may be part of it. For example, if I'm going to request a VPC from AWS, I'm going to be using an API to do that. But that doesn't really capture all of the components of what a network as a service is. So in our experience, what we're seeing is really network as a service is being comprised of three components. First being the consumption model, right? So we talked about API, and in this case, network services are going to be obtained and consumed and managed through API calls. In almost all cases, the network as a service System and Orchestrated are utilizing software-defined networking capabilities to orchestrate the configurations that need to change as part of that. And the services are defined at what I consider to be the consumable level of granularity. What I mean by that is it's an it is a kind of self-contained action that may be comprised of multiple smaller actions, but it really constitutes making a change. So if I'm going to request a VPC is a good example. Well, there's a lot of different components to that, but ultimately we've in the industry sort of have an understanding of what that constitutes, and so I can order that at that consumable level as opposed to having to say, well, do this step, this step, this step to give me what I need. That's the first part. The second part is the operations model. And this is, I think, one of the things that distinguishes really network as a service from something that's just purely an API. What I mean by that is network services offered in NaaS are really operated as a service, meaning not only is the configuration change happening, but there's also some level of network planning around capacity, service assurance, operational support, because this isn't really about consuming just the change. It's about consuming the change within the context of that service. So later on, Travis will show you a demo of a branch office network as a service. Part of it is a change, but the other part of it is making sure that the service is being monitored and operated so that service level agreements can be attached to that service. The third area is around the expense model. And we are seeing things break kind of in one of two directions, either a subscription model or a capital model. What I mean by that is in the subscription model, the assets are not owned by the consumer. So this would be a situation where, let's say, I'm purchasing network as a service from Azure. Azure owns all of the capital infrastructure, and I'm really just renting that service from them. So in that case, it's really about servicing external customers. And part of my offering is that I am taking the responsibility for the capital outlay as well as the operations of the systems. There's another version of network as a service where it's what we call the capital model, and it's where you actually own the network and you're exposing that. And we see that most commonly when it's a situation where an enterprise wants to offer network as a service capabilities to their internal customers, so that they both own the network and they expose the functionality through API at the consumable level, along with operations, all of those other two components combined with that to make it network as a service. So Travis, I know that you've got a lot of experience working with our customers around helping to transition them into the capability of delivering network as a service. Can you talk about some of the reasons why they want to do that?
Certainly. I find that a lot of our customers, they oftentimes will naturally evolve to treating a lot of their network as a service across their organizations, but they do it without intent. The ones that do it with intent are thinking very, very consciously about simplifying what they need to do in their network, simplifying the consumption of the services that their network offers, either their internal or external customers. They also have a lot of concerns around the costs and making sure that they see a time to value for the investments they put in their network. When they're treating their networks in such a way, they're able to increase the value over time of their new network investments, allowing them to install new technologies at new locations with new products and services on top of it, much easier than if everything was piecemealed or handled on a small basis. And the big one for me personally that I see a lot is security. A lot of our customers are very interested about their threat surface. And when you treat your network, when you treat all of your components as a service, you only have to focus on the service's outer threat level. Then you can automate, you can standardize, and you can put in place services that you're confident have a contained impact to anything that might happen to your network. Those are some of the big reasons. And oftentimes when they're thinking of their network, they're not always thinking top down. But thinking of network as a service brings them to that top-down thinking of how to look at all the products and services that their network can provide their organization.
Thanks, Travis. Okay, so what I wanted to do was, now that we understand some of the reasons why people want to provide network as a service, I want to talk about some of the models for doing that. And the way that we're going to describe it, we're kind of look at four different approaches here. The first one being, and using that kind of same model that we showed earlier around the green and the purple, network as a service really isn't an interactive thing where an engineer is logging into the UI, which is why that's shaded out. But it is something that can be consumed by an order system or as an event trigger or through a pipeline. The other thing that's a little bit different, and just to simplify, we pulled out the piece in the middle in the blue, and then what I did was describe some of the capabilities within the domains as services. So, for example, in the cloud domain, we've got public cloud service and we've got an internal cloud service. And then we've got some collections of services in the other domains. And this will make more sense shortly as we start to talk about how do we combine and expose and consume these. But in the first scenario, it's really about what's happening in a lot of organizations today, where you have developers that are directly consuming services from companies like AWS, Azure, GCP. They're whip out their credit card. They're going to subscribe to a cloud network as a service. They're going to consume it. Now, they may be doing this for a lot of reasons, some of which may be just purely out of convenience, and it may be creating some internal friction in the organization. So in a lot of cases, while it's not desirable, it is something that folks either have to permit because they're not able to offer that service, or for whatever reason, it's just really the only option. So the second model then becomes, well, how can I allow that to continue to happen, but perhaps put some kind of wrapper around it so that it isn't something where people are continually going directly to AWS, but that I can republish that in my own kind of exposure catalog. So I'm effectively repackaging that public cloud service. I'm exposing it through an internal catalog. I'm making it available to my developers and my other users, and they can purchase that. And at the same time, I get some level of control. I get some ability to kind of centralize the accounting for that. There is an opportunity then to make it so that I can channel them towards the public providers that are going to be either folks we have contracts with or folks that I want them to work with over others. The third scenario would then be to say, I want to augment that catalog. I want to go from just being a republisher of public cloud network as a service to be a publisher of my own network cloud services. And in this case, I'm showing an example of taking a security offering and turning it into a network as a service kind of service, which Travis will show you an example of how to do that shortly. But I'm basically exposing that in my catalog for consumption from my internal users. And it doesn't have to be just a security service. It can be any one of these kinds of services. But you'll start to see pretty quickly that there is a pretty big distinction between exposing like an action level capability versus exposing a service. And what I mean by that is there's very limited value in me exposing something that is so granular that like maybe I'm going to change a port name or do something like that, right? That's not really the kind of thing that you want to publish in your catalog, because it's just an action that happens that doesn't necessarily have the outcome being some kind of a service quality function. So here, think about how you're starting to shape some of the capabilities that exist in the automation and orchestration infrastructure, but shape them as consumable objects. So the fourth option is starting to create what we're calling combinatory or synthesized services, where you're starting to offer a service that is composed of services from multiple different domains And in this case, it's a combination of taking a public cloud offering, combining that with a data center service, combining that with the security service. So you would think of maybe this is some kind of overlay network with some security policies where I'm connecting some applications in my data center to some of my applications in the cloud. But ultimately, what you're providing to your internal customers is the simplicity of just consuming all of those different pieces just as a single service. So you can see as you start to think about how do I want to expose these things, you get tremendous flexibility and tremendous power because you can start to combine all of the different capabilities across the network into new kinds of things and things that are going to be easier for folks to interact with, which should speed up their ability to get those services pretty dramatically, should speed up consumption. So in one situation where we were talking to an enterprise customer, his goal was to make it as easy or if not easier to purchase services internally and consume them as a service than it would be to go to the outside world. And this is one of the ways you can do that is by creating these combinatory services so that it becomes very simple to consume. This just shows the example of all four. And really the flexibility is you can do all four of these simultaneously. You can republish a public service, you can offer a combined service, you can offer standalone services. It's really the only limitation is what you choose to expose through your catalog and what you choose to make available to your internal folks. So one other distinction I wanted to make kind of before we transition more into to the demonstration is, and I've mentioned a couple of examples of these, but I wanted to make sure that it's really clear. At Itential, we have customers that are CSPs, like service providers. We also have customers that are enterprise providers. So there are some cases where when we talk about a public service, this is something where a service provider is exposing part of their network to be offered as a network as a service product. For a lot of the folks that we're working with, the big transition is how do we shift from being very order centric, where maybe I have my OSS BSS order stack that is really the only mechanism for getting service. How do I start to move away from that order centric model to more of an exposure consumption model and really make the changes not only to the network infrastructure pieces, but then also think about, well, what's the impact that I need to have to things like the billing system? The other big activity that we've been working with them is what I talked about earlier around service composition and service decomposition. So how do I start to think about the capabilities of my network, both as these very small actions, but then these more compound kinds of activities so that I can start to more easily offer exposure at maybe multiple different layers, where I have some customers that really only want to make one request. I have other customers that maybe want to mix and match some capabilities to create some of their own combinatory things. So working that out becomes an important step in the process of thinking about defining the service, exposing the service, letting people consume the service. And then another big shift is around how do we start to orient operations around network as a service so that thinking about things like service assurance and service quality and responsiveness, that all changes a little bit when your primary interface with the customer is API, because there's a level of flexibility that they now have that if they're not happy with the service they're getting from you, they can simply call somebody else who's offering network as a service and move off of yours. So being able to make sure that you've got a responsive operational model becomes really important there. That contrast that with the things to consider around providing an internal service, right? We've talked about how to mediate exposure of external NaaS services, so I won't talk too much about that. But really, then I think the primary challenge is how best to offer those internal capabilities as NaaS offerings, where there are some organizations that don't necessarily have operational competence to think in terms of offering service level performance agreements on some of the things they provide. That is really the evolution that they need to start going through. And then ultimately figuring out what's going to be the best wrapper to put around things like these hybrid offerings, where you're combining things from public cloud providers as well as your own internal capabilities, thinking about what's going to be the model for providing performance and other kind of operational guarantees around a service where maybe you don't own every component of that offering that you're providing. And ultimately, the comment I made earlier around saying the goal would be, can I make it so compelling? Can I offer an internal service that's so easy to consume that there is no incentive to go outside? Meaning we're getting the best use of our internal assets and capabilities. We're able to fully exercise our security infrastructure, but at the same time, we're able to really effectively and efficiently serve our internal customer base and our internal developers so that there is no motivation to go outside to use some third party when they can more easily do what they need to do internally. So, Travis, as I said, I know you've got a lot of experience. Can you talk a little bit about what folks need to be able to provide network as a service capabilities?
Sure. First and foremost, it seems relatively obvious, but you need to have control of the assets configuration, be they your assets or leased assets. At an organizational level, you have to have control over them. Otherwise, you're going to run into roadblocks with dependencies upon third parties. Another thing that I think often gets overlooked in the beginning of the process for many customers is a clear vision of your offering catalog. What are you trying to provide to the users, to the consumers? Are you trying to provide one or two little things? Are you trying to provide end-to-end solutions for large things? It's something that you should put some thought into at the beginning of the process. Is, what is my offering catalog going to look like? You're going to need to have your organization's processes prepared to support integration of network as a service as a larger whole. We're not talking about taking a ticket to open a firewall port. We're talking about turning up a remote site or providing a VPC or creating an entire lab environment for some consumer in your org or a customer if you're selling it outside. So you need to have the business processes and the understanding of your business such that you're ready to handle network. It's very important that in order to manage all of this, you have an orchestration tool that can enable creation of these offerings. The orchestration tool needs to be responsible not just for understanding the network, but understanding the interaction with the network and the interaction with the business processes. The orchestration tool needs to know when information is coming in. It needs to be able to manipulate that information in a way that the network can understand, and it needs to be able to deploy those changes, that information, into the network and into the downstream systems so as to complete the process for the offering. There's also a few other considerations. The accounting ability of your organization needs to account for how much it costs so that you can bill internally or externally, depending on what you're doing. And you're going to want to have systems and processes in place for operating these services. Again, it's a little different than just operating your regular NOC environment. This is an environment where you're offering an entire service as a product. And so the support for that needs to be designed around covering all of those components as they operate together. Now, that being said, I think we ought to start off on our demonstration. So why don't I show you what we're going to be doing here? Okay, so here we have an example of a high-level automation. What you're looking at is a workflow. This is where a lot of the logic happens to orchestrate the different components into a whole service. As you can see, we have several sub-processes here. We call them child jobs. For example, if you want to turn up a remote site, you're going to need to do certain things, such as grab the information for that site, open some firewall ports perhaps on your internal network, make a configuration change on your network to allow the connection of the VLANs or setting up the VLANs or the VPCs. And then you're going to have to add all of those changes in the service to some sort of monitoring and inventory tools so that you can support it in an operationalized manner. After all that, you're going to want to also close out your internal business process systems. I've just given you an email adapter here as an example, but that could be Jira, it could be ServiceNow, it could be Salesforce, it could be any of your internal business processes. Those would need to be communicated with along the way as well. So let's get started. If we just go ahead and hit play here, you will see that this automation just kicks off right away. And what it's doing is it's not just affecting the changes in your equipment. It's not just affecting the changes in your other north and southbound systems. It's doing the entire process. It's making decisions along the way, decisions that you've codified, things that you've made standard, things that you know you can deal with in a replicatable manner. So that's the real value add here, is the whole process is all self-contained. And if you take a look, we now have a complete remote site turned up. Now I would like to show you the email that came in. So let's see if we can pop over and do that. So here we have the email that came in and shows us, oh, your automation was successful. So that's just a tiny example of how network as a service is going to be communicating not just with the network, but with the users and the organization's processes natively. Okay, so now that we've seen the process execute, I want to bring up a couple of different things. It can be executed in different ways, and it does have many components in here that are related around managing the data, the information, the structure of the service that you're building. For example, I don't always have the same equipment at a site. I may need to change the shape of the data in order to talk to a different piece of equipment. This is an example of a tool that allows us to change where that data comes from and where it goes out to and how it looks. These sorts of functionalities are important when it comes to managing how you run your network as a service, what your orchestrator is capable of doing. If it can't manipulate data and the logic, then it's not going to provide a whole lot of value for you when creating network as a service within your organization. Another key point is you saw me start this automation off manually, and that is certainly a feasible way to do this, but it's by far not the only way. We have created here a custom API endpoint that we're going to call with an external system to kick off the same automation. So let me show you that now. Here is an example of Postman. I've set up a post call to call our custom get new site service API endpoint. We're going to go ahead and send that off, and then we will see that this is happening right now as executed from our API. Already completed. I've received my email. So those are both examples of how to execute this workflow, how to turn up a remote site as a service. Individuals can come into your organization and say, I'm opening up a satellite office for a few sales guys and some technicians in Phoenix, and I need to make sure they're on the corporate network and that they have the proper authentication and the proper security access. And oh, by the way, they need to follow along with the standards. All of that can be automated when you treat your network as a service, and all of that can be accomplished with the proper orchestrator enabling you in the back end. I think that's about all I've got to show there, Morgan. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to you.
Okay, and just a quick reminder, if you have questions, please type them in the chat window and we will respond. But thank you, Travis. And just to kind of wrap things up, I wanted to cover some of the key takeaways for achieving network as a service capabilities in your organization. First is that point that network as a service is more than just exposing an API. And I think this is really a critical thing to say. You do expose the API, but always be thinking about what are the kind of operational wrappers, things like what Travis showed. How can I start to build this so that it is more easy for my end users to consume it? Second, good service design becomes a real enabler, that the more that you can think about how you want to package the things that you're going to expose, and more that you focus on usability, the easier it will be for people to discover and consume your services. One that we didn't talk too much about, but I think this ties in with some of the conversations that we had in our service orchestration webinar, that it's okay to start small and build from there, that you don't need to architect everything all at once to be able to have a compelling offering. You can do that in part by looking to synthesize some of those capabilities around taking things that do exist already in the public cloud, starting to combine some of your functionality so that it becomes a more valuable service for your internal consumers to be able to access. And then I think this is something that, again, if you think about some of the other webinars that we've done around CSCD, around service orchestration, there are tremendous opportunities for folks to think about how do they modularize their capability and then start to expose it for consumption by different groups. So you can take the same capabilities that you would expose network as a service, you could expose them as a service orchestration action, you could expose the components of that and some of the larger combinatory services to pipeline owners. And this really the opportunity to maximize reusability of those assets, which means that the value is being driven from multiple different angles. And as you build more and more of that infrastructure, you don't have to duplicate effort. You can simply just expose new things. We see Itential platform as being a real key enabler for a lot of our customers to be able to do NaaS, right? So it's not a NaaS product, it's a NaaS enabler. And so we really look forward to working with our customers and with new folks as they become potential users and explore further capabilities to have more compelling NaaS offerings. So with that, I want to say thank you to Travis. I want to say thank you to all of you for listening in on the session. We'll continue to answer questions as we can. But with that, I'm going to wrap things up and say have a great day.